Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis here at the National Endowment for Democracy. And on behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone here today to our presentation titled The Fractious Path, Pakistan's Democratic Transition, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow Raza Rumi. We're delighted to have with us on our panel Ambassador Robin Raffel, former Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, and Dr. Marvin Weinbaum from the Middle East Institute. As many of you may know, the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellows Program is an international exchange program funded by the U.S. Congress to host some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists who conduct independent research and outreach projects here at NED. Now in our 15th year, we've hosted more than 250 fellows from over 90 countries since the program's founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to freedom of expression in Pakistan. In 2013, for the first time, there was a peaceful transfer of power in Pakistan from one democratic government that had completed its tenure to another. These recent years of transitions have altered the country's trajectory. It is now straddling a democratic path. Raza Rumi's new book, The Fractious Path, Pakistan's Democratic Transition, records the major developments during this first civilian government from 2008 to 2013, after almost 9 years of military rule. Since then, political instability, regional conflict, and terrorism have hampered the country's democratic development, resulting in perennial political instability. Before we begin our panel discussion, Raza will discuss the key themes outlined in his book, along with the implications for the future of Pakistan's democracy. And I take a moment to note that Raza's book is for sale in the back of the room. For those of you that are interested, I would commend everyone to it. It's a terrific read. Let me just say a word about Raza. Raza Rumi is a leading Pakistani journalist and policy analyst who is currently a scholar in residence at Ithaca College. He serves as consulting editor of the Friday Times and is a columnist for Pakistan's Daily Express Tribune. A Fractious Path is his second book. He's also the author of Delhi by Heart, Impressions of a Pakistani Traveler. Raza's published numerous papers on security, development, and culture. Ambassador Robin Raffel is an independent consultant, having retired from the State Department in 2014 after nearly 4 decades of government service. Her last assignments in the State Department and Pakistan. Dr. Marvin Weinbaum is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He served as an analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research from 1999 to 2003. He's currently a scholar in residence and director of the Pakistan Center at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. It's really a great pleasure to have Ambassador Raffel and Dr. Weinbaum with us today. We'll now turn the floor over to Raza, who will speak for approximately 10 minutes, after which we'll turn to our distinguished panelist. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the International Forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NED Democracy. And if you haven't already done so, please take a moment along with me to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take the opportunity to thank the many staff members involved with the organization of this event, especially Research Associate Esha Hill. And with that, I'm delighted to hand things over to Raza.
Thank you, Chris. Well, first of all, and family, I suppose. And about this book actually is a collection of various essays that I wrote during 2008 to 2013. That's also the time when I became a full-time journalist. And I was under pressure always to write every week, a long piece on what had happened in the week. And so once I was here, and since I've been here for the last 2 years, so there's lots of time to go back and look at things. So my publisher said that why don't you make a collection and we can print it as a kind of record of that era. So I was a bit hesitant at first because these articles sort of lose their value because newspaper commentaries have a very short life. But then, if once read together and put together, they do give a kind of a overview of the time and era that Pakistan was undergoing. And it was a very important phase in Pakistan's recent history as well, because General Musharraf had ruled the country for nearly a decade, and he was ousted by a popular movement. And during that time, Pakistan's leader Benazir Bhutto was also killed in Rawalpindi. And amid that turmoil, and the elections were held, and a new civilian government came into power. Of course, the political instability has been a constant in Pakistan's history right from the very start. In the first decade of Pakistan's history, we had more than 8 or 9 prime ministers. And in the decade of 1990s, we had a total of 9 prime ministers, if you include the caretaker administrators as well. So there's a frequent turnover of civilian rulers, and then we've had 3 long stretches of martial law dictators. So in that sense, going back to democracy, rebuilding institutions, rebuilding the writ of the parliament is not an easy task. A lot of people know Pakistan, particularly here in the US, through the lens of security, the Taliban, the terrorists, or the US security interests. But there's a whole story of 200 million people within Pakistan that has also has shaped up concurrently. And those struggles, I think this book kind of illuminates some of those struggles. Not all, because it's not a kind of that was not the focus, but if read together, it highlights how Pakistan's parliamentarians, its politicians, its civil society, its various women and youth groups and movements are trying to sort of reclaim their right to rule and govern from very sort of constraining environment where the civil military bureaucracy is formidable, and where Pakistan's participation in the regional war on terror, the global war on terror, has given the military an upper hand in terms of decision making. There are 6 trends that I would like to highlight, during this period of 5 years, the first civilian government. And we are fortunate that Farhanaz Isfahani, also a fellow of NED last year, she's here, and she was a parliamentarian and a kind of a first-hand witness to the era. So maybe she will correct my mistakes after the event. But there were 6 things that happened. First is that after the new government came in, there was a kind of a redistribution of power, because Musharraf was ousted by a lawyers' movement which wanted to restore the dismissed Chief Justice. So we saw that power in Pakistan, also went into the hands of the superior judiciary. So the Chief Justice became a power center, and he started meddling even in executive affairs. At the same time, Pakistan's electronic media, which had been ironically deregulated under a dictator, Musharraf, also became a power player. So the civilian government and the parliament had to face these 2 power centers, and they frequently kind of influenced the governance and many policy decisions, and thereby limiting the space for the civilian government, in addition to the military, which has always been paramount in Pakistan's history. The second important story of this era is that Pakistan's parliament actually did a lot. This is a story which is less known. For example, the famous 18th Amendment was enacted in between 2010 and 2011, and which is a group of 100 plus clauses. So it did many, many things to rectify and correct the constitution, which had been amended by two dictators in the 1980s and 2000s, and reset some of the parameters of civilian governance. The most important part of this amendment was the decentralization and giving powers to the provinces, which have always been restive and complained of centralization in Pakistan. So today, a lot of Pakistan is actually far more decentralized as compared to other countries in South Asia and even many developing countries. Bangladesh, for example, remains a unitary state. India is a federation, and Pakistan has gone many steps ahead. Of course, the implementation of this structural change has been patchy and problematic. The third important trend was continued regional conflict in Afghanistan and with India in 2009, in 2008 November, we had the horrific attacks in Mumbai, and the perpetrators were linked back to Pakistan's non-state actors, and that kind of stalled Indo-Pak peace process. At the same time, the continued conflict in Afghanistan and the issue of Afghan Taliban dogged the government and its policy making. It was also a period, because of this regional factor, of a very rocky relationship with the United States. 2011 perhaps was the worst year, because it started off with the CIA operative Raymond Davis being arrested in Lahore, followed by an attack on the naval base in Karachi, and then the emergence of Osama bin Laden from a small town near Islamabad. And the year ended on the horrible attack on Pakistani soldiers known as the Halala attack, which led to further nosediving of US-Pak relations. And the relations could only improve in the early months of 2012. The fourth trend in this period was the issue of the Pakistani Taliban. As an offshoot, as a branch of the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban focused on the Pakistani state and Pakistan's people, and launched perhaps a series of worst attacks in the country. These attacks were targeted at civilians, they were targeted at Pakistan's military installations, at state installations, and even at the ISI offices across the country. And that was also a very, very sort of unsettling period for the democratic government, for which it was blamed as well, but some of it was also out of its hands, because the security policy remains under the purview of the military by and large. I think the final trend I would like to highlight is that in this period, with all this turmoil, etc., we also saw a reassertion of Pakistani women, its youth groups, etc. So the interesting part of Pakistan's this period's history is that Pakistan's parliament had the highest number of legislators. Of course, many of them were nominated, but by the constitutional arrangement, more than 70 women parliamentarians were in the National Assembly, and data shows that over 80% of business, for private and official and legislative proposals, came from women parliamentarians. So, which was a remarkable, moment in our history. And this was also the time that Pakistan actually passed two laws on sexual harassment, which makes it way more sort of advanced than many other developing countries with the passage of these two laws. And at the same time, as we all know, Pakistan is a very young country. The median age of a Pakistani today is between 23 and 24, and nearly 70% of Pakistan's population is below the age of 30. And so there was also this, the assertion and the desire of this young population to be heard and to be seen. So we saw it in the urban spaces, in the form of rise of Imran Khan, who captured the imagination of some of the urban youth. At the same time, the rise of new media and technologies also gave a platform to these young voices. So I think it's a kind of a very complex situation, because a country of 200 million people, unfortunately, much as journalists or analysts or policy wonks want to reduce it to simplistic formulations, as in civil military, or the Talibanization or extremism. All of that is there, but it's a very, very kind of a complicated process of democratization, as well as reassertion of civilian power. I would just end with what has happened after these 5 years that my book takes stock. What we know is that the rise of Pakistani Taliban and their terrorism led to many more attacks. And estimates say that nearly 60,000 Pakistanis have died in the last decade. And the most heinous attack was in Peshawar in 2014, when 140 kids and teachers were killed. So that led the Pakistan's army to launch an operation against the Pakistani Taliban. The critics say that that operation is not holistic, because some of the other jihadist groups which are involved in proxy warfare in Afghanistan or India are still intact. But that at least the official statement is that they want to go after them too. When and how, we need to see that. But that has also meant that there's been a reassertion of military and its slow re-emergence in national affairs. And today, the army chief is also very popular, partly, contributed by the media image that he has, and partly by fighting this war, Zarb-e Azab, it's known as the big military operation against the Pakistani Taliban and the sectarian militias. So, which has reduced the number of terror incidents and has also made things relatively secure, thereby creating more confidence in ordinary Pakistanis about the state's capacity to deliver. Yet the big issues in Pakistan remain. They unfortunately have yet to be handled, and some of those big issues, unfortunately, have to do with the sort of global things like climate change, disasters, the looming water crisis in Pakistan, and many other developmental challenges. And that is what Pakistan's democracy in future faces a major challenge. Its ability to deliver services, entitlements, and security to Pakistanis. And until the parliamentarians and the political parties don't focus on that, the credibility and the legitimacy of Democrats would remain as a question mark. So I think I'll end there, and then we can talk more in the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Raza, for a very cogent assessment of these complex cross currents that are confronting Pakistan. And now we'll hear from Ambassador Rafel.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank NED for the opportunity to be on this panel with two very distinguished people. Raza Rumi, as you know and could tell, is a very astute analyst and a very respected voice in Pakistan. And I've learned very much from him over the years. And Marvin Weinbaum, whom I've known, I won't say how many decades, but we first met in Iran many years ago. So I'm really delighted to be on the panel with these folks. And I'd also like to commend Raza for this book. It really is an excellent compendium and a very good teaching tool, I found. I've done a couple of classes this summer and have really appreciated having that as a reference tool. So any of you who teach, make sure you buy several copies of that book. I think Raza has given a very clear comprehensive sketch of what's been going on in Pakistan over the last, since 2007, 2008, not quite a decade. And I am going to answer the question that was put to me. That question was, where do you see Pakistan's democracy headed, given that the military still calls the shots? This is the sort of question that comes up frequently. And in answering this, I will echo some of the things that Raza has said, which I very much agree with. I think the bottom line is that while there are many reasons for and manifestations of political instability in Pakistan, which Raza has highlighted, I still think that it is possible and that there's a good chance that Pakistan can continue on a positive trajectory. It will go like this, there's no doubt. There will be bumps in the road and hitches, but I think there's a better chance than there's been in a long time for a positive trajectory. I, for one, think that these democratic transitions in 2013, after the government for the first time completed its term, really do signify that there is some consolidation of democracy and civilian rule going on. And particularly since in 2014, the government survived what was really quite a dramatic kind of challenge with the Damas, with the demonstrations in the capital in 2014, which went on far longer than anyone would have predicted and sort of disrupted traffic patterns and made everybody think, what on earth is going on here? And of course caused echoes of the whole idea of, is there going to be a coup? And for various reasons, that all subsided, and the government emerged, perhaps a bit weaker, but it certainly emerged. And I think that is a very good sign. I think the devolution, the 18th Amendment, which Raza spoke about, is another good sign of taking seriously the need to spread the power out away from a military dictator or an executive that's too powerful, and put it down to the provinces and even below, where people are closer to their government. They're closer to the entities which actually deliver services and so on. It's far from perfect, and there were many, many screams and whines and so on with the 18th Amendment. And my own view was always that it was forced through the Parliament rather quickly. But I think the sense of the fellow who was in charge of that was if he didn't get it through quickly, it would never go. So I think that is a good sign. Another good sign is that the country really is coalescing around an anti-militant strategy and philosophy, and has really given the go-ahead to the military to take on the militants in North Waziristan and Pakistan. And I know many felt that this should have happened earlier. And my understanding is that the military had long had a plan to do it, but they just didn't quite have the nerve. And frankly, the civilian government wasn't giving them the cover they wanted. But finally, after this huge tragedy in the school in Peshawar, they went forward, and the government and the parliament and the public at large really did support that movement. Again, not perfect, work in progress, but very important. On the economic side, again, I think that there's been quite a bit of progress, particularly under the second government, under the Sharif government. As you all would have heard, there's a huge problem with load shedding and power, but gradually the government's beginning to gain on that. Some new sources of power have come on board. Tariffs have been increased. There are plans laid out for more power sources, and there's a lot of experimentation and investment in alternative sources of power like wind and solar, which helps a bit to get at the concern on climate change. So those voices are being heard. I think there's been progress on service delivery, a bit on education, certainly a very acute awareness of the need and the pressures on the government to deliver better on services. There's been some tax reform, not as fast as anyone would like, particularly the IMF, but progress is being made, and similarly on privatization. So I think there's progress on the economic side, which ultimately is what underpins political stability. That's very good. The regional situation, as Raza described, is not very positive, but I think at least it isn't falling off a cliff. You know, it's sort of sustained. And I think on both sides, the East and West, which are the two challenging parts, that there's a sense both on the Pakistan side and the Indian side that they need to figure out how to get there. Get there, by which I mean to start to really talk about the issues that divide them. And similarly, I think on the Afghan side, the Afghan government gets very frustrated at certain points over various incidents and so on, but then they come back to realize they need to be able to deal with Pakistan. So I think there's potential for improvement, but I don't see it really falling into the negative sphere. Some of the things that we don't always talk about or notice because we are security focused, as Raza said, we see much of what happens in Pakistan through a security lens, is in fact the media, the talk shows, the proliferation of voices in the public sphere. It's extraordinary to any of you who were in Pakistan in the days of Pakistan TV, and that was it.
Yes.
Now, again, it's not perfect, and sometimes when things get too contentious, there's a sort of chill that's sent through the media. But by and large, if you look over the past decade as a trajectory, the media is much more active, and it's rather impossible really to stem the electronic media and all the rest. And of course, in a country like Pakistan, everybody has a cell phone. Many people have a cell phone.
Yeah.
Landlines are kind of passé, left over that, and the cell phone culture and the texting and the social media are very active there, and civil society and culture, and the cinema is taking off again, and all this kind of thing. I think it helps again, like the economy, to bolster a political transition. So, really, does the military call the shots? On some issues, yes. Certainly on internal security. They were the ones who decided to go into North Waziristan,
Yes.
am I right?
Yes.
On regional security issues, on India and Afghanistan, on the security side, they certainly do. On what happens with Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, which is an issue of concern to the U.S. government, they certainly call the shots. And sort of overlying all this authority that the military has assumed, you do have a very, very active media activity on the part of the military, the ISPR. And they, it's one of those situations in which two can play at the same game. You've got social media pushing on the government and pushing on the media, and you've got a very well-funded and sophisticated operation pushing back. So there's no doubt that the military has a lot of power, but I think there are two issues that need to be noted in this regard. And the first question is, why is that? And the major answer to that, in my view, is that the civilian government is weak, has been weak, off and on for decades. Now, you can say, is it the chicken or the egg? Did the military make the civilians weak, or are the civilians weak and therefore empowering the military? But I think the whole legacy of poor governance, of the military, of the civilian governments being distracted by political infighting. You know, every time a government comes in, they spend a lot of energy chasing after, you know, bringing cases against the previous government, that kind of thing. And in some of the issues where it looks like the military has been the decisive voice, sometimes the real issue at the end of the day is that the civilian government hasn't done its homework. And a very good case in point is a few years ago when we were all hoping on the outside that Pakistan would follow through on a commitment it had to give what is known as most favored nation status to India. They called it something else, NDMA, but it amounted to that in global trade parlance. And it was thought that the military had really squelched this effort and had very categorically told the government they couldn't do it. And while I think it was true that the military wasn't keen on this, a large part of the problem for the government was that they hadn't really got on board various sectors of the economy that would have been affected in a big way. Auto parts, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, where the Indian companies were just much more efficient and much stronger. So, you know, sometimes when it looks like it's the military, there are also other things operating which really do affect the civilian government's ability to move. And if they'd done their homework in that case, you know, went directly to these sectors of the economy and said, look, here's how we're going to help you over the next 4 or 5 years so that you won't be disadvantaged, then you would have had everybody on the civilian and economic side, private sector side on board, which would have made a much stronger push on the civilian side to get this done. So it's examples of how the civilian government is weak and how that sort of lets the military step into a void. The other thing is, the other question one has to ask is, if the civilian government were actually running all of these issues and sectors and whatever, would they have done things differently? And I think the answer in some cases is yes, but in some cases probably no. And I think in more cases than we realize, the government basically agrees with what the military is doing. I think internal security is a good example of that.
Yeah.
I think the government certainly supports that. And I think the government certainly acquiesced in the military courts because the civilian judicial system just wasn't able to deal with all the terrorists that the military was wrapping up. So I think the government agrees on that. I don't think the government, frankly, would change the nuclear policy. It's too publicly popular. So I think with India, they'd move faster on the political side. I think on Afghanistan, they'd move faster on the political side. But in some of these areas, the civilian government actually doesn't disagree with the military. So where does that leave us? Again, I'd reiterate that I think the chances are good for a positive trajectory in terms of civilian governance, broadening of the opportunity for public voice in government, and that the real drawback, and this is where those of us on the outside really are working at trying to figure out how we can help, is in institutions, particularly for the civilian government. The institutions have not kept up with the demands of modern society, whether it's in education, health, regulation of the media, or whatever. The military, on the other hand, is a very strong institution. So how Pakistan can improve its governance and institutions of governance, civil service reform, I'm sure those of you who work on Pakistan have heard that a million times. We need civil service reform. These are the kinds of things, I think, that need to be focused on to bolster the civilian government side and bring it up to the organizational status of the military so you have a much more normal interaction among the various sections of the government. Thank you also.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rafael. And now, pleased to hear from Marvin Weinbaum.
Well, it's hard to know what to say. Robin has so thoroughly, comprehensively covered the political landscape that I'm speechless. No. But let me see if I can somehow make some comments that somehow she did not. I was asked, have recent developments, including the 2013 peaceful transfer of power, made a true difference in Pakistan's democratic government? And I don't think there's any question that transfer of power in 2013 from the PPP government to the Muslim League government was a milestone in democratic development. As all of you know, I imagine, that had never happened in Pakistan before, at least not constitutionally, at least not without the intercession of the military. There had been, and I would submit to you that there is no more important marker in democratic procedure, democratic government procedure, than that, much more so than elections. Elections can take place, but we've seen too often where after the elections, one side doesn't want to pass power on. So I think it was a very significant difference here. Why did it happen? It happened, and I think this is relevant for today, it happened because Nawaz Sharif, who was then in the minority position, his coalition in the minority position, was willing to wait, as he was not in the 1990s, nor was Benazir Bhutto, for the next election. The feeling was, and I remember this discussion once with one of the close advisors to Nawaz, I said, why are you doing this? She's going to lose in the next election. You can have it. To which his response is, if we don't act, there won't be a next election. That, I think, summed up in many ways why Pakistan's democratic process could never really move along. So this was significant that he was willing to wait and not do what had happened during the 1990s, in the period that I'm talking about where they worried about the next election, and that is, as soon as they got into office, from get-go, it was, how do we delegitimize those who are in power? Oh yes, there was also, you could always bring up the card of corruption, and you would never be for a loss about having examples that you could make. But the very delegitimization was, I think, so telling here as to what it was all about. Well, this time around, Nawaz, that is from 2008 to 2013, Nawaz did have the good sense and had learned, I think, from his experiences in the 1990s that he could have it if he waited. And he did have it with a very substantial control of the parliament for having done so. Now, having said all this, I'm worried. I'm worried because really what we're seeing, I think, right now is perhaps conceivably a return to that 1990 period. We have now an effort on the part of the opposition, and we need not go into the competence of this government. It certainly has lost a lot of its luster. There's a great deal to be said about corruption, but the fact is that now we have parties whose mantra is resign, resign. Not as bad as what we heard at the Republican convention in terms of, but it seems as if now that kind of willingness here to persevere with that government in power is now eroding, and I think that this is reason here for us to wonder whether that transition that took place in 2008 is going to be repeated. And I'll thought about that again in a moment. Something else happened in 2008, though, which has already been alluded to here, and that is with the election in 2008, we saw a willingness of the military to give more slack to the elected civilian government, and to keep the coup as an option well into the back burner. I don't think that the generals today are any less disdainful of the political class, but they are more content, given the experiences that they've had, to let it govern, albeit within a sphere which is, as far as they're concerned, pretty well defined, so that it's minimal intervention if they stay within those boundaries. The military will use its leverage that it has with the media in particular, and with its own crew of politicians, to threaten the civilian government when it appears to be overstepping those lines. And I think that that's what we have seen over the last 2 years, and that is a contributory factor to the encouragement of the opposition parties now to go that delegitimization route. Now, naturally, Nawaz Sharif is in part responsible for that, because as he did in 1999, when he provoked the military coup, he likes to test those limits. So he has to be reminded ever so often, and one way in which he can be reminded is that the opposition can be encouraged to stir up things, and to which the government, and they played this with Zardari as well, can say, look, if you don't play ball, you're out of here. We're willing to let you finish your term of office, but look at what can happen if we let these people continue to run. Because I don't think the government today wants to see, the military today wants to see a new election. But it doesn't mind using the threat of a new election against the government. I say it doesn't want a new election because it's too unpredictable, and the likely beneficiary will be Imran Khan, and he's a loose cannon. the government, honestly, because he has a popular following here, which he might use against them. They do value what the public has to say. So all of this, as has been suggested here, that those boundaries, of course, are national security and foreign policy. And the government, the military doesn't mind the civilians like Sataz Aziz playing around in those areas, but only as long as their actions are in concert with the military's views. I don't think we should have any doubt that the military is prepared to take the helm should there be major persistent disorder in the country. But just as the military may have changed after 2008, so has the public. Thanks, I think, to social media and communications in general having changed, I think that a preemptive, premature action on the part of the government will be resisted. I don't doubt that in the long run the military can prevail, but I think the military is sensitive enough to know that. And I think this acts as an important constraint. Now, there has been some erosion in public support for democracy since 2008. There's no question about it. We've got some polling which indicates this, and that's worrisome. But I don't question the fact that if there is a breakdown in public security, as could easily happen if the parties want to pursue that route and the military is willing to give them some space to do that, that the public would stand behind the military just as they did in '99 and find that the military was a preferable alternative to disorder. Now, we had another question. Do you want me to go on to that question now? Yeah, okay, let me do that. And then we had one question which both of us were going to respond, or all of us were going to respond to. Let me quickly do this. I was asked, what can the U.S. actually do to support Pakistan's democracy, human rights, and freedom of the press? Well, not much. Yes, it has leverage of a kind, but if those who exercise power decide that, or determined to pursue a policy which degrades civil liberties and democratic rights, I don't think we should, for a moment, think that we can stop that. We might, and I'll say about this, discourage it, but certainly not prevent it. So and that's true whether it's an autocratic civilian regime, as Nawaz Sharif was emerging with in 1999, or it is a military regime. I think that it holds for both. Now, whether the United States would even be inclined to do so is another issue. It will, as it always does, as it undoubtedly perhaps can help doing, is to weigh its options. And that is to say whether the costs of truly trying to prevent the government from proceeding with its actions, whether this is compatible with what the United States views as its strategic interest in the region. And of course, that's exactly what we're faced with today in Turkey, where we're torn and we find ourselves holding back on the kind of criticism that would normally use. Let me move on quickly here. Let me also notice that Pakistan is a special problem because even the appearance of intervention, hectoring on the part of the United States, can have a counterproductive effect. Why is that the case? Because in much of public opinion in Pakistan today, there is the view that if the United States is strongly pushing for something, it couldn't conceivably be in Pakistan's national interest. Now, I do think that that doesn't mean that we should not try to promote, the United States should not promote what it believes in. There are indirect, subtle ways to display our position and our commitment to universal values. Of course, the best way in which we can do this, at least an important way, is to live up to those ourselves. We don't have to be neocons to believe that who believe, by the way, that our mission is to spread, if not impose, democratic ideals on others. But let me give you just some quickly, and end with this, some ways in which I think we can and should. And that is, even if we're reluctant to become involved, as I was alluding to before, the powers of global communication now, especially with the rise of social media, offer opportunities that we didn't have in the past to put pressure on a regime. Private sources, but also quiet government support, can strengthen those elements in civil society that defend democratic values and human rights. Exchange programs continue to be very important. It's proper to say that particularly here in this setting. These can be very important because done right, what they seek to do is to reach to those people who will be, if not now, then in the future, opinion makers. We should applaud those developments in Pakistan where the initiative has come from the Pakistanis, but is a positive development. There, I think that as long as it seems to be that Pakistan has decided something is in its interest, then we have the leave to applaud. And of course, we need not to do this alone. We've got to do this in concert with the international community, because I think then it will have a far greater impact. So what I'm saying then is that we should not say that there's nothing we can do. There's a great deal we can do as long as we recognize that in the end, we're not going to be the decision maker in this regard, with regard to human rights and the defense of democracy.
So I'd like to thank all three speakers for their insightful comments. We have a bit of time left for questions and answers. I'd please ask if you have a question that you offer your name and affiliation and keep your question as succinct as possible, because I already see quite a few hands, and we'll try to get as many in as we can. So we'll start over here. Why don't we start in the back?
Thank you very much. I appreciate for giving me the opportunity. As Marvin said, that Imran Khan is a loose cannon. Probably it was just a slip of tongue. He wanted to say Donald Trump. Anyway, about Marvin, he has mentioned the transition from 2008 to an elected government to another elected government. I think at least because of poor performance, lack of performance, or dismal performance, the party collapsed and at least the federation was saved once. So Robin had mentioned about that the civilian government agrees with the army in the area of security and partly in the area of foreign affairs. Could she tell us which are the areas where the civilian government disagrees with the military in this case? And the question is not about the sustainable democracy in Pakistan. My question is, what is the future of Pakistan without sustainable democracy?
Terrific, thank you. So we'll take a couple more, and then we'll let the panelists respond. Why don't we go here?
My name is Hira Toki, and I've been working with NDI Pakistan before coming here for more than 4 years. So my question is, I was just wondering if you have mentioned the role of democratic institutions like NDI and RRI toward the strengthening democracy, starting from the policy amendments to FATA reforms. Thank you.
Why don't we take the gentleman right there?
My name is Ibrahim Nasser. I'm with the Voice of America. My question is almost related to the gentleman at the back, but I just want to focus on Afghanistan. If, Robin, you could answer this. If the civilian government was in charge of Afghan policy, how would they deal with Afghanistan differently from the military?
Thank you. So probably what you-
Okay. To take your very specific question there, and this is just my speculation, because I was trying to, the point I was trying to make is that in many, many ways, the civilian government and the military pretty much agree. But I do think that the civilian government would number one, want to be much more forthcoming with their counterparts on the Afghan side. I think they'd be keener on implementing, say, the trade agreement, the transit trade agreement. I think they would be more open to how they could help with getting reconciliation going. It's not an easy subject, but I think they'd look at it with a broader canvas, that sort of thing. And I just think there would be less tension and exasperation than is felt now if the civilian government had a freer hand. But, you know, let's be honest, there are genuine tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Afghanistan wants to blame Pakistan for everything that's happening inside Afghanistan, when in fact their own house is largely responsible for what's happening. So I just think you'd have a more open dialogue and a friendlier attitude and a less bristly attitude if you had the civilian government in charge. But the underlying, and you'd have, I think, more desire to help on the economic side and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm.
The Afghan government continues to blame Pakistan that militants still have sanctuaries both in Quetta and North Waziristan. Would civilian government do anything different from military if they were in charge against the militants?
You know, this is a very complex problem from the point of view of the Pakistanis, civilian or military, because they have prioritized their own military action, number one, and number two, as I'm sure you know extremely well, from the Pakistan perspective, they've always been concerned about the end game in Afghanistan and how long the foreign forces were going to stay, and what ultimately was the shape of reconciliation, what is the power of the militants and influence on the provinces bordering Pakistan. So it's a complicated picture from their point of view, as you know well. I think a civilian government, if they had more confidence and authority would put these issues more squarely on the table in a way that they might be dealt with more expeditiously one way or the other, that a real dialogue would get going rather than this kind of thing which tends to happen now. That's just my speculation.
I think Marvin Weinbaum.
Yeah. Well, I'm less sanguine about civilian government. Remember, it was the civilian government that was pushing more than the military for striking a deal with the TTP. It was the military government that was much more in line with Imran Khan's views on the fact that that these people really were people you could negotiate with. There was the military never thought that that was going to be possible. But they gave, this is one of those times when they gave the civilian government, because people were desperate, obviously, to see the conflict ended. And like the Afghans, if you can tell them there's going to be a political solution, who's against it? Well, they learned the hard way when they tried, and they tried 6 times. The military did the first 5, but the 6th time was the civilians. When the military said, it's not going to work, but if we undermine it, we're going to get blamed for it. And they gave them, and of course it fell apart on its own. Look, in a way, it's a non-question, because the military, if they control anything, this is the sort of realm that is theirs. Now, I think as far as the negotiations with Afghanistan, there was a major change in the view, my estimation, in the view towards Afghanistan when Ashraf Ghani came over and he said, look, I'm willing to give you a cooperative Kabul. I'm willing to do that. At that point, given also the pressures of the extremist militants within, when they finally woke up, both the civilians and the military, to the fact that their internal threat was greater than their external threat. It didn't mean that they didn't view India in the same way, but in terms of the immediacy of the crisis, it was internal. That together here put, I think, both the civilians and the military on the same page. That is, they were willing to go for a political arrangement with Kabul. The trouble is they couldn't meet the basic requirement which would convince the Afghans that they were sincere. And that requirement was, if you're sincere, you boot out the Afghan Taliban. You arrest those people, you get rid of those people. That they could not. And then also Pakistan could not get what it wanted, and that is, of course, it wanted its Taliban thrown out. But it found that it had a weak government in Kabul, a government headed by a man who has all the ideas and none of the political support that he needs to further those ideas. So it's a little different take on this.
I would just add, if I might there, that part of the issue here is, and what I was suggesting is that if the civilian government had the upper hand, you might have gotten to a real discussion about the facts of the ramification of, say, the Haqqani network and the Afghan Taliban inside Pakistan, because I think the Pakistanis, you ask them, and they're candid, they'd say, we would love to get rid of these guys. We'll just airlift them over to Afghanistan. At which point the Afghan government would say, well, no, actually, we don't want them here. That's even worse than having them there. So you would start to peel the onion on what the actual possibilities are. in dealing with these various groups and in dealing with the fundamental problem. I think part of the problem, I mean, these issues are very difficult, but part of the problem is that you never get to a really honest discussion. You never really get to the table where you're analyzing how to give each side what they really need.
So we'll move to questions on this side. I just want to ask Ambassador Rafael one question. Something caught my ear. You mentioned, I think twice, there are good chances for advances through civilian reform, but the real trick is for institutions to meet growing societal demands.
Right.
If you had to prioritize or kind of identify what sorts of things would need to happen in the foreseeable term to kind of deepen the institutional capacity to meet these demands, what would that be?
Let me say a couple of things very quickly, and then we'll move on. My own view is that the real problem with military governance and the amount of time that it's been in, military governments have been in power in Pakistan, is that it disempowers the civilian institutions, which weren't that long-lived anyway, since Pakistan's a young country. Every time the military comes in, the civilian institutions atrophy and don't continue to put down roots and develop and evolve and modernize and get more effective. So that's the situation you have. I mentioned civil service reform. The Pakistani bureaucracy isn't very modern. It's not very efficient. It's not very effective. And it's not, at this point, very accountable. So you need, civil service reforms. You need, the devolution is part of it. It's started. You need, in my view, and I think experts, real experts agree, with health provision and education and so on, you need the accountability to be devolved very close to the community so that whatever community can have a say over their schools and pronounce on whether the teachers are good and this kind of thing. So people feel they're really getting services delivered. It's that kind of thing. And Pakistan is behind where it should be because of its particular history in that regard.
Thank you for that. Let's take questions from over here. Right, let's just start here, and then we can take a couple more after this gentleman.
Skami Batan with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question to Mr. Weinberg is that because diminishing support of democracy in Pakistan, is that because of perception of corruption in the current governments? There were stories about People's Party that Mr. 10% is billionaire now, but if you are pro-PP, you would say he still makes his living by selling ticket in movie cinema. Same thing about Mr. Isakdar, who is Minister of Finance in Pakistan. Sayyid Adib, he told me that he used to wander around in Lahore on Vespa motorcycle or scooter, and now he owns like 40-story buildings in UAE. So, and my question to Ambassador Rafael, I would love to agree with your presentation, but given Mr. Raza Rumi's presentation, or given that Pakistan is the only country on earth where the average height of a man, instead of increasing, it's going down because of malnutrition. It doesn't seem to be a viable state anymore. It's like it seemed to be a too hot potato for Israel, for USA, or for India to take care of this country. So the people who are elite or Pakistani general, they are just trying to get whatever they can get, and they are keeping their children and they are keeping their stolen money out of the country. So that sounds like more, that make Mr. Raza Rumi's presentation more realistic. That's
Sir, you can
Pakistan.
pose your question. Thank you.
So is that have Pakistani elite left Pakistan as a viable state, or they are just kind of looting whatever they could and then leaving the country? Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll take a couple of more questions, and then we'll come back to the panel. So we'll take this gentleman here.
Thank you. Jay Kansara with the Hindu American Foundation. It seemed that towards the end, at least, of Zardari's administration, the issues of the Hindu minority were getting the most media coverage. The case of Rinkle Kumari, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the ongoing exodus of the Hindu community was getting quite a bit of attention from even the New York Times and BBC as such. But it seems in this administration we have more systemic changes that have actually taken place with the Hindu marriage law hopefully being enacted soon, as well as, you know, the Holi and Diwali and other festivals being celebrated at the government level. Do you feel that this is because the civil society space is open, Nawaz Sharif's government is taking this issue more seriously, or it's pressure from US, India, or other parties seeking for Pakistan to enhance its tolerance at a civil society level?
Thank you.
Two more, this Azima and Sairaj.
Okay, let's do that. We'll go to the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Malik Siraj. I'm a journalist and a former fellow here at NED. Congratulations over this wonderful book. Last week, everybody was shocked over this news about the dishonorable killing of Kandil Baloch in Pakistan, which has brought the issue of honor killings again in Pakistan. Every time somebody asks a question, there are two perspectives. This is what the civilian government thinks about the issue. This is what the military thinks about it. But why can't the Pakistani government unite on certain issues such as honor killing, such as minority prosecution? So what is actually being done right now in Pakistan with respect to addressing the issue of honor killings? As we know, every year more than 800 women get killed in Pakistan in the name of honor. And where does the military stand on it, or where does the civilian government stand on it? Do they need to have different perspectives? Or, as I always believe, like, women's rights are human rights. Why can't Pakistanis unite on this issue?
Okay, then we'll take one more over here. Yeah.
Hi, Raza. I'm Azima. I'm a visiting faculty member at the National Defense University in Islamabad and a public opinion researcher. I've been working on elections for quite a while now. Raza, you and I talked about the lawyers' movement. And that was one of those, Imran Khan's and the 2014 dharnas have had so much amplification in the US and compared with the actual impact. And movements like the lawyers' movement didn't. They didn't get a lot of attention. And that's the one that has a resonating sort of impact on Pakistani politics and how Pakistani political competition has actually increased. So I just wanted you to comment on a little bit on the legacy of the lawyers' movement. And secondly, in response to that question that was raised about Pakistani political parties being more inclined to fight militancy, the last Lahore attack, none of the three major parties would condemn Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan by name. PTI, PPP, PMLN, they don't. ANP and MQM tweet them. They will come back and condemn them by name. But at the moment, it's lack of political will and ownership that is preventing a national consensus.
If you speak out or whatever, but I think that the solidarity that was shown after that Peshawar attack, even if it didn't sustain at the highest point over time, still was a step in the right direction. On the lawyers' movement, actually the lawyers' movement got enormous play here, enormous play. Photographs on the front page of the New York Times and all of the rest of it. So I think it got enormous play. Imran Khan is sort of an iconic figure. He also got play for the same reason he did in Pakistan, but I think it's wrong to say that the lawyers' movement didn't get play. And on corruption, of course there's corruption. I mean, that is a phenomenon globally and very, very much so in countries at the stage of development of Pakistan. It's the same problem in India. It's the same problem in Afghanistan. And, you just have to gradually work through it with laws and slowly build accountability into the system. We had it big time in the 19th century here and, Chicago and all of that. But gradually we moved beyond it. So I'll stop at that.
About the lawyers' movement, I think that was a flash in the pan. The lawyers' movement, for those of you who don't follow it that closely, was critical to the ousting of General Musharraf. It played the central role here in its support of the Chief Justice Chowdhury. What it demonstrated after that fact was that it wasn't in any way a democratic expression. It was peculiar to the judiciary itself. Remember, how can you forget how it threw rose petals at the man who killed the Governor Salman Taseer? This was the lawyers' movement. If you look at the composition of the lawyers' movement, you'll find that it's conservative, that it has never supported progressive causes, and it isn't really a movement. And I think it's telling that Azaz, Asan, I'll get it right, who is the lawyer for Chowdhury, broke with him completely, because I think Etazaz does represent, to the extent that there really are democratic thinking political activists in Pakistan at that level, does represent that. So and as for just quickly about corruption, let me say that as long as you have a society where there's scarcity and there's uncertainty, you've got the ingredients for corruption, big time. And until societies get past that, then you have the kind of willingness here again to be able to look into the future and to, I'm missing the right word I want here, but it is a sense here that you put your faith in the future and the future of your own opportunities and those of your family. Okay.
So I know there have been a number of questions, and there were a number that people had that we couldn't get to, and I apologize for that, but I'd like to give Raza a chance to respond to whichever elements of the questions he would like. And if you have a mind to do so, you touched on this very briefly at the end of your presentation, this notion that there have been some positive steps that sometimes get lost in the lens that through which Pakistan is viewed, which is principally the security lens. So if you have a mind to touch on some of the other developments that you think are salutary and worth noting, that would be welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll quickly do it because I'm mindful of the time. You mentioned about the minority rights in general, and of course the Hindus in particular. I mean, you know, it's an open secret. We don't treat our minorities very well, and for decades it has been the case. And it's a very complex sort of history of how Pakistan imagines itself to be this Muslim country, and then all the subsequent legislation and constitutional changes done under General Ziaul Haq. But you know what has happened, as you rightly pointed out, in the recent decade, and particularly it has to do with the opening up under these two weak but effective democracies, is the fact that you have more and more power of media, social media, civil society movement, and pressure for the government and the state to do something about it. And that is why it is, an ironic thing that the current Prime Minister in the 1990s, he had actually drafted a Sharia bill. So, he fancied himself, in the light of Mr. Erdogan as well. But his party has, evolved over the years. And today it is actually embarking on the most progressive reform, whether it's the Hindu marriage bill. And to address your questions, Hairaj, the PM's daughter, just announced that they're going to push the law against honor killings and make it stronger. So these are very ironies of our time, because Nawaz Sharif was always known as the conservative right-wing politician. And, after all these battles, political battles and, weathering many storms, he has now become far more progressive in his view. So there is some opening over there. On the issue of honor killings, I mean, I fully agree with you, Haraj, and I don't think that the military has a particular role or should have a role. I mean, of course, General Ziaul Haq is the one who introduced these Sharia laws of Qisas and Diyat, where a murderer can be forgiven by his family for killing a member of his or her household in the name of honor. And so, obviously, how far will this new law go to overcome the structural constraint remains to be seen. But the fact that the Prime Minister and the Parliament are responding is a proof in itself that it's, that there is this space for human rights. On the issue of corruption, I think I agree with both the panelists. It's an evolving transitional society. But just to pick a point from Ambassador Robin's earlier presentation, the issue is accountability. Pakistan's institutions, unfortunately, have faltered and decayed over the decades, that we do not hold anyone accountable, whether it's a general, a judge, a bureaucrat. The unelected have this supremacy in Pakistan where they can get away with virtually anything. So, and the politician who goes to the people each time he or she has to be elected or re-elected faces all the music. Part of it's also the construction. Oops. Partly it's also to do with the narrative that Pakistan's media and the military have constructed. That is, the politicians are inherently corrupt. They are inherently incompetent. They cannot be trusted. They are, in the 90s, Benazir Bhutto was a security risk. In 2016, Nawaz Sharif is a risk because he likes to talk to Modi. So we have this problem in Pakistan. But having said that, I think the issue is not to say that money has gone abroad. This is, after all, a globalized world. Capital flows everywhere. That's not the issue. The real issue is to strengthen our judiciary, strengthen our anti-corruption commission and anti-corruption institutions, and focus on that they hold people to account the way, the US presidents and congressmen, everybody's answerable to, at various multiple fora. And that is the real challenge. I think on the lawyers' movement, Azima, thanks for highlighting that, because that's what I'm currently working on as well. I mean, I really don't know how much traction it got in the US or not, but I mean, I wasn't here. But obviously, I mean, it must have worried the US, because Musharraf was, after all, a very trusted ally of the US in the war on terror. So it must have caused a lot of consternation. But I think certainly it is a moment, it is an intriguing moment of our history. As Marvin rightly said, it had conservative dimensions. It had, the sort of anti-politics more, dimension to it. But at the same time, it was a huge space opener within Pakistan's middle class, the disenfranchised segments of society who found a voice in that larger rubric of fighting for the Chief Justice. Everybody joined in, because these are the new sort of elites which have come into being in the last 20 years, who find that they do not have any power in the traditional power matrix. And the lawyers' movement was a vehicle for that articulation, and some of it has gone into Imran Khan's party, the same sort of people you can see there, and the same sort of narrative is there. So it is an ongoing thing. And Imran Khan is also conservative. I think the last thing I want to handle is what you said about the political parties' lack of condemnation. I think as what I cover in this particular book is that in 5 years, the PPP, MQM, and ANP did show a resolve against extremism, at least in terms of articulating as a political policy, as a political position. But, the military was not on board at that time to go into North Waziristan for a variety of reasons. Now that it has, the politicians should have actually joined hands, as you rightly say. But once again, they are shy or afraid of naming certain groups. There's partly the issue of security. There's also partly the issue of not annoying their right-wing support base, and there are other complex issues. But I think, unfortunately, what I see is that after the Peshawar incident and the formation of National Action Plan, there was a large, widespread consensus in the public to go after